Let me set the stage. You're a young entrepreneur and you're looking at potentially selling your business, and you realize that you could walk away with millions of dollars. And then the next thing you realize is even if you walk away with millions of dollars, you're still going to have 20, 30, 40, 50 years maybe even to live on this money. So what factors should you be looking at? What things could you be considering? Hey everyone, I'm Jacob Turner, former Major League Baseball player and current co-founder of Moment Private Wealth. In today's video, we're going to walk through a hypothetical scenario that we see quite often. A young entrepreneur exiting his business for millions of dollars. And we're going to walk through 6 things to be thinking about inside of an investment portfolio that ultimately affect how much money he can spend, what the timing of that looks like, and how to reduce the stress level over the next 20, 30, or 40, 50. To understand what we're going to walk through from a strategic standpoint, I think first we need to understand how it feels emotionally and mentally and why this is so important to talk through. Oftentimes when somebody sells a business or they're an athlete and they're retiring and they have a big lump sum of money, they're oftentimes richer on paper than they've ever been. Think about the entrepreneur that we're going to walk through. You've worked 10 years, 20 years to build this business, and now all of a sudden you're liquid and you have all this money. So while you're richer on paper than you've ever been, oftentimes you feel poor, and the only reason for that is you don't have that steady income coming in from the position that you were in before, right? If you were president and CEO of this business, you were making a solid W-2 salary every single 2 weeks from this business, and now all of a sudden you're not making that anymore. So it's really important to understand what are the elements that we should be considering in the plan, because the goal with money is that we use it as a tool. And the worst thing you can do is sell your business, be richer on paper than you've ever been before, and be more nervous than you've ever been before about actually spending the money. Remember, the goal is not to die with the most amount of money. The goal is to use money as a tool in your life. So as we walk through this plan, I want you to think about the 6 areas that we're going to talk about and how those different things affect the plan. Some of those areas are going to be things like, well, what happens if the market drops by a certain percentage right when I invest the money? What happens if my tax rate goes up in retirement? What happens if I don't get Social Security or Social Security is not a thing anymore? These are all things that you need to be thinking about when you're making plans for the next 20, 30, or 40 years in the future. So I want to introduce you guys to Tim and Jenny. Tim was an entrepreneur and he built his business over the last 10 years. And ultimately, he ended up exiting his business for a few $1,000,000. So what I first want to look at is what does their total picture look like after he exited this business? So you can see their total net worth here is about $6 million. Tim has a 401k through his business that's worth about $750,000. He also has a Roth IRA that's worth about $100,000. They have a joint savings account or their cash account that has about $50,000 in it. Jenny's Roth IRA is worth about $100,000. They have a primary home worth $1 million, and then they have a taxable trust account or money that's outside of retirement accounts of about $4 million. This is what came after taxes from the sale of Tim's business. And what they're saying is, how much can I spend in retirement with the understanding that we're only 40 years old and we know that things are going to change drastically in the future. And on top of that, there's a million unknowns. So we always want to start with what is the baseline spending going to look like? And then we're going to talk through those 6 things that we always look at in the portfolio to really stress test this and say, will this work over a really long time period? So as I mentioned, the first thing we want to look at is what does it actually look like from a spending perspective? And for Tim and Jenny, they have a very modest lifestyle. They're saying we want to spend about $10,000 a year from the portfolio, and we want to be able to do that in perpetuity moving forward. And that's going to be our baseline starting point. So just $120,000 a year is what they're going to start with spending. From an income perspective, or the second factor that we always want to look at is what is the potential income coming in? So as I mentioned, Tim sold his business. He's not going to be working full time, but he really loved the business he was in. So he said, I wanted to take on some existing consulting work where he projects to make about $30,000 per year. We're also expecting Tim and Jenny to get full Social Security at Social Security age. So in this plan, we're baking out that they will be getting Social Security. The next thing that we always look at is savings. So in this scenario, Tim and Jenny aren't going to be saving any more money. Tim's made the money from selling the business. We're not projecting right now on this baseline scenario for them to be saving any more dollars. So does this plan work? Does their $6 million net worth, with about $5 million of that in liquid assets, they're 40 years old, Lord willing, they're going to have another 40 years or more to live on this money. And what we can see here is our Monte Carlo says they have about a 93% chance of success. So as a reminder, the way that we view these Monte Carlos is think about a plane taking off. When a plane takes off, do we need to change flight? Do we need to change course? And in this scenario, we would say about 7% of the time, there's going to be things that come up that we're going to need to change course. But again, the way that we always think about this, especially for younger entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs is we just want to establish the baseline. We want to establish where we're at today with the understanding and the assumption that this thing is going to change in the future. So Tim and Jenny are in a great place today. They're almost in such a good place that I would say we could be more aggressive with the spending, because as you think about a 93% chance of success, that means oftentimes they're going to retire, they're going to live on this money, and they're going to end up with more money in the legacy bucket or more money that give to the next generation than they even thought. So this is almost more conservative than we'd even recommend typically. But really the biggest thing I want us to look at today in this video is these 6 items that could derail the portfolio. And the reason why I think some of these items here are so important to think about, especially for younger entrepreneurs, is again, we got to go back to what we talked about at the beginning. It's not as much always about the strategy. The strategies are really important, but it's also about your mentality and how you're feeling about this money. You're richer on paper than you've ever been, yet oftentimes you feel poorer than you've ever been because you don't have that consistent income coming in. So we're going to look at 6 things that could happen, 6 complete hypotheticals. And the reason why we like to look at these is we like to stress test the portfolio, for one, from a strategic standpoint, but it also gives our clients a ton of peace of mind knowing, oh, we've actually looked at this and seen if the market drops, if taxes go up, if Social Security goes away, what happens to my overall plan? So let's take a look at what some of these scenarios could potentially look like. So the first scenario that we're going to look at is what happens if when we invest this money and I stop working, the market immediately drops 20%. We all know what the numbers say. 3 out of every 4 years, the stock market goes up. But we also know 1 out of every 4 years, the market goes down. And it's not completely out of the norm for the market to drop to the 20% level. Now, on a $5 million liquid portfolio, 20% is a lot of money. So when Tim and Jenny open their account, they're going to see it down hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars if it was a near 20% drop. But does that actually change their plan? So as we talked about, the baseline plan has them at about 93% chance of success. So 93% of the time, we're not going to have to adjust the plane in flight. Now, what happens if they have this 20% drop? You can see their plan actually only drops by about 5% to 87%. And I think this is really important to think about because this is one of the most common ones that we see. If I invest all this money right now and the market drops 20%, does it change my plan? And as you can see right here, for Tim and Jenny, it really doesn't. The next thing that we're going to look at is Social Security. So I know there's a lot of people out there that feel like, if you're younger, that Social Security might not be there when you retire. The reality is, I don't know if that's totally true, but I do think it's really helpful for clients to see if it's not there, what does that potentially look like? So what we did in this scenario is we went all the way to the other end of the spectrum. We said, instead of you getting your full Social Security, what if we reduce that benefit by 100%? We said, you're not going to get any of it. How does that affect the plan? And as you can see here, our plan goes from 93% down to 90%. So overall, for Tim and Jenny, Social Security doesn't play a huge role in what their plan looks like moving forward. The next thing that we're going to look at that's been on the top of everyone's mind recently is inflation. We know that inflation has been rampant for the past couple of years, and ultimately inflation is going to be one of the biggest things that we're going to have to constantly keep an eye on in any portfolio like this, where somebody's investing the money at a really young age and they had this really long time horizon. Because even just the subtlest, the smallest changes with inflation can make a huge difference. So what we went ahead and did here is we said, what if inflation is 3% higher than what we're projecting? In a typical plan, we're projecting around 3% inflation. So what if inflation's 6% over the course of this plan? How does it change it? So as a reminder, our baseline started at about 93%. We bumped up inflation by an extra 3%. What does that look like? As you can see here, our plan, our success, our probability of that goes down to about 42%. So we have a massive drop. We go from 93% down to 42%. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we're failing. It just means that we need to be conscious of the fact that inflation will most likely play a huge role in our planning moving forward. We need to be constantly aware of what inflation is. We need to understand how inflation can affect the portfolio, because we can see right here, while Social Security didn't really affect the portfolio, inflation drastically does. The next thing that we're going to look at here is what does our actual returns look like? And then if we lower those returns over this really long time period, what does that potentially look like? So in this base case scenario, we're using about a 7% rate of return, which I think is really a conservative rate of return given how aggressive they can be with their portfolio. But what happens if we reduce that by about 2%? So instead of us earning that 7% rate of return, we're going to earn a 5% rate of return. And remember, Tim and Jenny are only 40 years old, so they have decades for this money to compound. You can see right here, if we drop it by 2%, we go from that 93% chance of success down to about a 67% chance of success. So what does that really mean? What are the factors? What are the things that we should be thinking about in that scenario? And what I would say is one of the biggest things that we need to be thinking about is making sure that we're not invested too conservatively. For a lot of the entrepreneurs that we work with, when you're selling a business at a really young age, like 40 years old, you want to make sure that yes, you have money in the war chest, which we consider bonds or cash, very safe assets that are going to be there for you during the ups and downs of the market. But we also need to make sure that we're being very aggressive with the other money, because the reality is we have a really long time horizon to invest. So it's this constant tug of war. But as you can see right here, inflation makes a big difference. The asset return makes a big difference. Social Security doesn't make a huge difference. And the reason why I like looking at this is then the client can then sit there and say, hey, we've talked about these different scenarios. We understand what are the most important ones, while some of the other ones, maybe they don't matter quite as much. The next thing that we're going to talk about is taxes. So everybody's favorite word, taxes. What happens if taxes are higher in retirement? So one thing to think about for Tim and Jenny is because he's already sold the business, he's already paid all those taxes, he's now going to be investing the money and he's going to be getting capital gains treatment on these taxes. In addition to that, one of the things that we always focus on with the clients we work with is making sure that we're investing this money in as tax efficient manner as possible. While taxes play a huge role in how much wealth you keep, and they play a huge role in investing, it is important to note that Tim and Jenny's tax bill is going to be a lot lower than a typical individual because of now their money is going to be coming from capital gains income, which is going to be treated differently than ordinary income. So as you can see right here, what we put in was we said, what if the tax expense was about 20% higher? You can see it only drops the percentage by about 1%. And the reason for that is, again, the money that they're earning from their portfolio is going to be sustaining most of their lifestyle. While Tim is going to have that consulting position where he's going to be earning $30,000, they're still going to be in a really low projected tax bracket. So it's really important to understand, based on their scenario and their situation, taxes won't play a massive role in the potential success or failure of their plan in the future. The last thing that I want to look at here is longevity. So what happens if they live longer? So typically what we model out is for clients to live somewhere into their 90s. But what happens if they live to 100? What happens if they live to 105? We all know that medicine's getting better. And I think this is a really important thing to think about. We don't want to outlive our money, but we also want to have that constant tug of war saying we don't want to leave more money in our legacy bucket than we actually expected to. So for Tim and Jenny, what we said was, let's go ahead and map out, if we lived an extra 10 years, what would happen then? So as you can see here, we put in the extra 10 years, our percentage of success goes from about 93% down to about 90%. So we still feel very confident that even if they were to live an extra 10 years, their plan is still going to work out really well. And again, the reason why I think this stuff is so important is because we always want to be understanding what is the base case scenario with the clear understanding that things are going to change in the future. And I think as we look at this and as we map this out, these are 6 areas that everybody should be thinking about if they're mapping out 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And the biggest takeaway for me as I look at this is, one, each plan's individual. For Tim and Jenny, taxes don't play as big of a role because of the way that their income is going to be taxed. But inflation does play a huge role because they're going to have this really long time horizon. Their asset return does play a huge role. The market dropping immediately after they potentially invest the money doesn't play a huge role. These are all different things to consider. And the reason why I think it's so important for families to look at stuff like this is, again, we want to provide that peace of mind. Although they've been richer than they've ever been before on paper, Tim and Jenny don't feel great about it because they don't have consistent income coming in. So we want to get out in front of inevitable scenarios that are going to come up in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years of retirement. There's a couple of big takeaways here for me. I think the first and foremost one I want you to understand is that even if we're planning for 30, 40, 50 years out into the future, we always need to start with a baseline because it gives us something to go back to. It gives us something as a starting point. The other thing to think about is there's going to be inevitable things that come up, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. The best thing that we can do is plan for things that we think might happen. And I think what this video articulates really well is it shows you what are the things that are most important for me to be thinking about. Inflation was a huge factor. Asset return was a huge factor. But there's all these other factors that might go into your specific situation. So making sure that you're asking the financial team around you that these are the stressors that I have. Can we plan around them? What things should we potentially be thinking about if we're going to plan around them? And ultimately, remember guys, money is a tool. We want to make sure that we're spending the money we have to better our life, to better the lives of the people around us, to bring joy to the people around us. The goal of money is not to die with the most amount of money. The goal is to actually use it in our own life. But oftentimes that means we need to understand what elements we need to be thinking about in our own plan. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. I put out videos every single week, and my goal is to help you get smarter with your money.